Dr. DEEPAK Chopra, a world-renowned leader in the field of mind-body medicine. After teaching at Tufts and Boston University Schools of Medicine, he was Chief of Staff at New England Memorial Hospital, a best-selling author of 12 books, including Ageless Body, Timeless Mind, and Quantum Healing. He's the Executive Director for the Institute of Mind-Body Medicine in San Diego, California.
In the last session, I think I gave you a reasonable hypothesis to understand the body, mind, and the environment as a continuum. I thought we covered enough evidence to see that that, in fact, is a good probability that the distinction that we have between the body, the mind, and the environment as separate things is really an artificial one created by the interpretation of our perceptual experiences. That in fact these are all part of one network of energy and information that comes into existence from a field that is a priori, that is even before this continuum of energy and information. And that it is possible for human consciousness to even experience this reality, to have the experience of what is known as unity consciousness, where the observer and the observed become one, where the seer and the scenery become one. And this has frequently been referred to in spiritual traditions as the experience of love. Love not as a mere emotion, love not as a mere sentiment, but love as the ultimate truth at the heart of creation. Love as the experience of unity consciousness. Tagore, that great Indian poet whom I quoted last time, once said, "When I feel beauty, I know it as truth." And what is beauty? It is love at the heart of creation, this continuum of no separation. That even time, in fact, or the experience of time, is similarly self-engendered, because in reality there is only eternity. Time is a perceptual experience. If you read Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, and you read the introduction to that book by Carl Sagan, there's an extraordinary statement in that introduction. It says, Stephen Hawking set out to understand the mind of God. Stephen Hawking set out to understand the mind of God. As far as I know, there's only one other scientist who was audacious enough to make a similar statement. Albert Einstein once said, "I want to know God's thoughts, the rest are details." So what kind of conclusion does he come to when he sets out to understand the mind of God? He says, we live in a universe that has no beginning in time, that has no ending in time, that has no edges in space, and nothing for a creator to do. Now please try and conceptualize that, and please try and visualize that, please try and imagine that, and you'll find it's totally and utterly and completely impossible. How can you conceptualize or visualize something that never began? Scientists use the word Big Bang in the first 3 minutes to postulate that the universe had a beginning, at least in space and time. But the fact is, you can't visualize that. It's non-visualizable. And the moment you compromise and say, perhaps there was a beginning, then of course your immediate dilemma is, if there was a beginning, what was there before the beginning? If there's an ending to this universe, then your immediate dilemma is, what's there after the ending? If there are edges in space, then what's there after the outermost edge? It turns out that quantum physics is not only stranger than we think it is, it's stranger than we can think. At least the way we can think linguistically, the way we can think in this verbally elite language of ours. But of course not in the mathematical language, which seems to be the language of nature. Mathematics is the language of nature, but mathematics in its equations, of course, always takes into account zero and infinity, which are non-conceptualizable visually or at least linguistically. So we see that even the experience of time is created in our consciousness. It's a result. Our personal experience of time is a result of our own internal dialogue. A few years ago, I was traveling in Germany, and a physician friend of mine drew my attention to a news report. It was about 7 miners that had been trapped in a mine. And they knew that they had very limited amount of time because they had limited access to oxygen. And only one of the miners had a watch. And in order to allay the anxieties of the others, every time 2 hours went by, he would call out 1 hour. At the end of the week, they were all rescued, and they were all alive, except for the fellow who was calling out the time. He had them change their subjective experience of time. But of course, he measured his own experience by looking at a watch, even though he had the rest of them change their subjective experience of time. Time is a subjective experience, and you cannot measure subjective experiences. A great English physicist, Sir Arthur Eddington, he said, trying to measure a subjective experience is like trying to figure out the square root of a sonnet. You can't do it. You cannot do it. You may find some objective correlates. And yet time, feelings, emotions, desires, these all occur in this quantum realm of consciousness. So in order to just summarize what we have covered so far, I'd like to go over a few principles. And let's see if we can look at these a little carefully. The physical world, including our bodies, is actually a response of the observer. Intrinsically, it's a radically ambiguous and ceaselessly flowing quantum soup. You and I are like magicians, like King Midas, who could never know the texture of a rose or the soft caress of a kiss because everything he touched turned into gold. Similarly, in our usual state of consciousness, our waking state of consciousness, we leave aside other realms of consciousness that seers and sages have talked about for thousands of years. There's an ancient expression, infinite worlds come and go in the vast expanse of my consciousness. They are like motes of dust dancing in a beam of light that's shining through a hole in the roof. Leaving aside that, in our ordinary, usual, waking state of consciousness, we can never know the true texture of quantum reality, because even as we turn to perceive it, we break it up into material reality, into time-bound reality. And that time-bound physical world is a response of the observer, and how the observer uses the instruments of observation, the nervous system. But in its essential state, our body, as well as the universe, is made up of energy and information, not solid matter. All our technologies are based on this presumption, that in its essential state, this is a non-material, non-physical universe. That the mind and the body are inseparably one. They are the same thing in different disguises. The mind is a field of information and energy being experienced subjectively. The body and the world is the same field of energy and information being experienced objectively. That even the biochemistry of the body is influenced by awareness. We saw that in those experiments with rabbits and tactile kinesthetic stimulation, etc. Sensory modulation, how we utilize or experience our sensors. Our sensors are transducers that take the energy of the universe. So our sensors, for example, the ears, are transducers, electronic transducers that convert mechanical energy into electrical energy in the brain. Our nose and smell receptors convert chemical energy into electrical energy ultimately in the brain. Our eyes are receptors that convert electromagnetic radiation into electrical energy in the brain. These are transducers. And this experience that we have of the flood of hormones in our system is really, or flux of chemicals in our system, is really the way we metabolize our sensory experience. If I say to somebody, you have cancer, immediately there's a rush of toxic chemicals in their body as a result of the fear that's generated. If I say to someone, I love you, there's a completely different response. But as far as the ear is concerned, all it gets is mechanical energy, vibration. A few years ago, I used to volunteer at an AIDS clinic, and they had a silly custom. On Monday mornings, they would take the blood tests of all the patients. Wednesday, they would announce them. So the doctor would sit here, and all the patients would sit in a circle. The doctor would pick up a piece of paper, and he'd say, John? He'd look at John and say, negative. And you would see John's whole body immediately. You could see the flush of energy and life in that body. Then he'd take another piece of paper, and he'd say, George, positive. And you would see the rush of toxic chemicals in this person's body. You could see the life ebbing out of this person. You could see him actually dying before your eyes. And I asked myself, what's the difference in the vibration of the atmosphere when you say the word positive and compare it with this word negative? They're just little vibrations in the atmosphere. They tickle a few hairs in your internal auditory canal. There's a little blip of electricity. The input is identical. In fact, you could produce the identical input with those words positive and negative. And yet the output is radically different. So somewhere there's been a detour. And that detour is not in the material realm. It's in the quantum mechanical realm. It's in that field which is beyond both body and mind. And even the biochemistry of our body is a product of this awareness. That perception, even though it appears to be automatic, is a learned phenomenon. We learn how to perceive as a result of our cultural indoctrination, our social indoctrination, our evolutionary history, etc. In reality, impulses of intelligence create our body in new forms every second. Impulses of intelligence are impulses of information and energy. They are our thoughts and feelings and emotions and desires. That although each of us seems to be separate and independent, all of us are connected to patterns of intelligence that govern the whole cosmos. That there are no well-defined edges to the quantum mechanical body. We are localized bundles of information and energy in a universe of information and energy. This universe is alive with information and energy. But it's not ordinary information and energy. It's information and energy that feeds back upon itself and influences its own expression, which is evolution. Evolution is nothing other than the ability to change the expression of information and energy. So we can't call it just information and energy, it's intelligence. This is an intelligence universe, and we are conscious beings in a conscious universe. And the human nervous system is that privileged organ of nature through which the universe itself is becoming conscious of itself. The universe is becoming conscious through you and me. And that is the privilege we have as this human species. That although we seem to be separate, we aren't. We are, as the great American poet said, every atom belonging to you belongs to me. That even time does not exist as an absolute, only eternity. Time is quantified eternity, as it is quantified in consciousness. Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, once said, this lifetime of ours is like a flash of lightning in the sky. He said, this lifetime of ours is as transient as autumn clouds. To watch the birth and death of beings is like watching the movements of a dance. A lifetime rushes by like a torrent down a steep mountain. But we identify ourselves with our self-image and not with ourself. That's why we get the experience of time. That in reality, there is only eternity. That each of us inhabits a reality which is, in fact, beyond all change. And I'm going to come to that. I'm going to come to that very important point, because there is a component here, a component of existence that is beyond change. And that, for lack of a better word, we can call the soul or the spirit. Now, of course, if you go to a scientist and you say you have a soul, the scientist will usually respond by saying, I'd like to believe that, show me where it is. Scientists would say that of the mind as well, because as you probably will have figured out, there's no real proof that the mind exists, no scientific proof. We have only circumstantial evidence that the mind exists. And yet, if it weren't for the invisible animating force of mind, we would all be paralyzed. I wouldn't be able to speak to you. I wouldn't be able to move here. So thoughts have an animating force, an invisible animating force without which we would be paralyzed. And yet you can't document scientifically that this thing actually exists because you cannot see it under a microscope. So the same thing holds true of a soul. What is the soul? The soul, every religious tradition, every spiritual tradition, every part of the world has called it the animating force of life. It holds the integrity of the body and mind, and when it leaves, of course, then the body disintegrates because this was the animating force. In the last century, scientists who were intrigued by the notion of soul would actually weigh a person sometimes just before they died, and then they weighed them immediately afterwards to see if something left. But since they didn't find any difference in the weight, at least they came to a reasonably good conclusion. If you have a soul, it probably doesn't weigh anything. In our own century, there was a brilliant scientist. His name was Wilder Penfield, and for 30 years he looked at, this question: where is the thinker of the thought? Who is the thinker of the thought? Because I'm not my thoughts. I'm the one who's having the thoughts. I'm not my emotions. I'm the one who's experiencing my emotions. I'm not this body. I'm the one who's having the experience of this body. The body is an experience. The mind is an experience. The world is the experience. But where's the experiencer? Dr. Penfield was very interested in finding the soul, in finding the experiencer. And when he would operate on his patients, he would stimulate different parts of the brain to see what was happening. Dr. Penfield would do operations under local anesthesia because the brain is that part of the body where you can, in fact, stimulate different parts of the body, of the brain, without causing any discomfort or pain. The brain doesn't have any pain receptors. And one day, Dr. Penfield was operating on a young woman, and he touched a part of the brain, and the patient was immediately transported to a previous experience. She found herself in a kitchen cooking food for dinner, and she heard herself listening to her children playing in the yard, and actually she even experienced herself worrying that they would be run over by the traffic. And Dr. Penfield asked the patient, are you really in the kitchen? And she said, no, I'm speaking to you and you're doing surgery. And Dr. Penfield said, this person is having two experiences at the same time. On the one hand, she's in the kitchen, and on the other hand, she's speaking to me. In other words, there's a silent witness behind the scenes that knows that this is the sensory experience, but this is the reality. Another time, he was operating on a young man, and he was immediately in the middle of a baseball game. He suddenly had the experience of a baseball game that he had seen 20 years ago, and even saw a little kid coming through the fence into the crowd, and at the same time he was aware that Dr. Penfield was operating on him. But he was able to make the interpretation that this was a hallucination and this was reality. And Dr. Penfield wondered to himself, where's the interpreter and who's the interpreter? Another time, Dr. Penfield was operating on a young man. He was stimulating a part of the brain known as the motor cortex. And as he was doing so, the patient's arm started going up like this. And Dr. Penfield asked the patient, what's happening? The patient said, my arm is moving up. And Dr. Penfield asked the patient, are you moving the arm? He said, no, you're moving it for me by stimulating the brain. And then actually what the patient did was he reached out with his other arm and prevented the arm from moving, even though Dr. Penfield was stimulating the brain. And Dr. Penfield wondered to himself, he said, the brain is telling the body to move, but there's somebody that's telling the brain, I won't let you do it. Who's this choice maker, and where's this choice maker? You and I are essentially interpreters and choice makers. In every moment of our existence, we are making interpretations and we're making choices. We are the thinker of the thought. We are not the thought. And if you're sitting out there and you're saying, I doubt everything that you're saying, I don't believe any of this, then that's who you are, the doubter. As long as there's a doubt, it implies the existence of a doubter, the thinker of the thought. Where is this thinker? Where's this soul? Why can't we find it in the body? Dr. Penfield said, I can't find it in the body. And the crucial question is, why can't we? So the soul has been referred to as the thinker of the thought, the animating force. And we saw that both from Dr. Penfield's experiments and other pioneers in this field of mind-body investigation, if you will, it cannot be found anywhere in the body. You can't find this ghost in this machine through all the technology that we have. Today it's possible through sophisticated technologies to measure the effects of a flicker of an intention, a microsecond after it's made. You can measure the effects of a flicker of an intention a microsecond after it's made. But the question is, whose intention? And where's this person? You can't find this person inside the body. This person, the essential me, that's an interpreter and a choice maker. You can't find the real me, the interpreter and choice maker in this body. Why can't you find me in my body? And the answer to that may be relatively simple. The reason that you can't find the real me in my body is that I'm not really here. Today, if you go to any bookstore, go to the metaphysics section, and you'll find a number of books on so-called out-of-body experiences, when the real mystery, of course, is how do we get an in-body experience? Because technically speaking, we're not here. Anyone who has delved a little bit into spiritual literature, and by spiritual literature, I certainly don't mean the latest New Age bestseller. By spiritual literature, I mean those bodies of literature that gave rise to the great religions of the world, like Judaism and Christianity and Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism and Zen and the great religions that are everywhere and are the cultural heritage of humanity. Anyone who's delved into that kind of literature will come across an expression which says, we are in this world, but not of it. In this world, but not of it. Perhaps that's not a metaphor either. Perhaps we can find a basis for that statement. Imagine that you're listening to Beethoven on the radio, and you tear the radio apart, hoping to find Beethoven inside the radio. You're not going to find him there for the simple reason that he's not there. The radio is an instrument that traps a non-local field of energy and information into a space-time event. So, since I've introduced these terms, let me explain what these terms mean. A space-time event. A space-time event is any event that has a location in space and exists in moments of time. So, this here is a space-time event. It has this location in space. It has moments in time in that there was a time it didn't exist, and you can be sure there will be a time that it won't exist. This physical body that I'm using to manufacture this talk is also a continuum of space-time events. It occupies different locations in space. It has moments in time. It had a beginning, it has a middle, and it disappears after a while. This body, for example, started out as a speck of information on DNA. Then people started adding food to it, and I have this thing now that moves around. manufactures lectures and writes books. So it's a space-time event. The radio is an instrument that takes a non-local field of energy and information. Non-local in that you cannot localize it in either space or time, and traps it into space-time. If you had the radio in New York City, the symphony would be New York City. If you had the radio in London, the symphony would be in London. If you had the radio, the instrument, on the moon, then the symphony would be on the moon. And if you had the instrument in another galaxy, 100 million light years away, then that symphony would be in a different dimension of time. Because 100 million light years away is a different dimension of time. Time is a way of measuring space, just like space is a way of measuring time. So, like that, the real you is non-local. The animating force of life is non-local, not trapped in space and time. The body, the nervous system is the instrument that gives it space-time experience. But the real you is non-local. The great Sufi poet Rumi again, he says, in a very elegant poetry, he says, you are the unconditioned spirit that's trapped in conditions, like the sun in eclipse. In another place he says, when I die, I shall soar with angels, but when I die as an angel, what I shall become, you cannot imagine. Because I'm not in space or time. Ancient traditions, when they speak of the soul, they say it's spaceless, it's timeless, it's dimensionless. In the Vedic tradition, when we hear its description, the description says, fire cannot burn it, water cannot wet it, wind cannot dry it, weapons cannot cleave it, because it's ancient, it's unborn, it never dies. Pretty close to the definition of the field by modern scientists. Pretty close. So Stephen Hawking's description of the universe. It has no beginning in time, no ending in time, no edges in space. That's pretty close to the ancient description of the animating force of life itself. Spaceless and timeless and dimensionless and the abstract, and yet the ultimate source of creation. The thinker of the thought, the choice maker, the interpreter, giving rise to space and time. I think we see a very good agreement here between what science, with its modern insight, has to say, and what spirituality and spiritual traditions with their ancient wisdom have to say. They're speaking about the same thing. And if you say, well, if I'm not in this body, then where am I? The answer to that seems to be, it's the wrong question. Because as soon as you say where, you imply a location to something in space that doesn't have space. You imply a location in space to something that doesn't occupy space. And you imply moments in time to something that's timeless. And yet, you. The closest we can get to this, and the way we can access this realm of our own awareness, so to speak, the thinker of the thought, is through the silent spaces between thoughts. Because between every thought that we have is a space where we manufacture the thought. So let me see if I can explain this a little graphically. In every space between every thought is the thinker of the thought. This is a thought, let's say. I'm going to have chocolate ice cream. This is a thought. I'm going to make a phone call. This is a thought. I'm going to take off my shoes. Well, between this thought and this thought is me that has the thought, is the thinker of the thought. So the thinker of the thought is in the spaces between thoughts. And it has two characteristics to it. Number one, it is silent. It has to be silent because if it's not, then it's no longer the thinker, it becomes the thought. Number two, it's a field of infinite possibilities. Infinite possibilities, infinite potentiality. Why? Because between this thought and this thought is the possibility of any thought. Between this thought and this thought, I have the freedom to choose. So the thinker that is manufacturing my thoughts and the thinker that's interpreting my thoughts right now out there are both silent fields of infinite possibilities. Is it possible there's only one thinker? Is it possible the same thinker that is manufacturing these thoughts is the one that's interpreting those thoughts? Is it all self-interaction? And some people would say yes. And yet we know that there is a difference. You and I are different because even though we are fields of infinite possibilities and pure potentiality, in the silent space between thoughts, we don't usually make the same choices, even though we are infinite choice makers. I see a snowstorm, and the thought comes, maybe I should be in Hawaii. And you see a snowstorm, and the thought may come, maybe I should be skiing. Somebody else sees the same snowstorm, and they think, snowman or snow fight. So even though the space between thoughts is a field of infinite possibilities, there's a different probability amplitude. A probability amplitude is that which defines the statistical likelihood of the next space-time event. In this case, the next thought which leads to the next action that leads to the next life experience. You and I are different because we are different probability amplitudes in that field of all possibilities. So what gives rise to the different probability amplitude? And here I'm going to invoke an Eastern term that seems pretty scary to those people who don't really know what it means. The term in Sanskrit is karma. The word karma has very frequently been translated as destiny, but it's not. In fact, it's the exact opposite. If anything, karma is the ultimate affirmation of free will and choice. Karma simply means action. So if you have a cup of coffee, technically speaking, that's a karmic episode. Any action is karma. And action generates memory. If I have a cup of coffee, I know what coffee tastes like. Memory becomes the basis of desire. I might want to have coffee again, maybe this time a cappuccino or decaf. And desire, of course, generates action again. Memory, desire, and action. These are the software of the soul. The operational software in the space between thoughts. You and I are continuums of probability amplitudes in the silent spaces between thoughts as a result of our experiences. What makes you different from me is that we have metabolized different experiences in our past. We have walked through different gardens. We've knelt at different graves. We've heard different songs. We've met different people. We've read different books. We've been brought up in certain cultures. We have metabolized every wisp of experience that has come our way, and we've converted into this software that runs the machinery of our life. To become aware of this is to be free of this, because it immediately shows you that this is just a probability amplitude in a field of infinite possibilities. I was going to make a right turn, but now I know that that was just an automatic response as a result of my past experience. I don't have to make a right turn. I can make a left turn. I can stand on my head. I can go back. I can take a helicopter. There are infinite things I can do right this moment. So to know it is to be free of it. To know that this is the software of the soul. To recognize that is to be free of it. Back to that same expression that I used earlier. I use memories, but I do not allow memories to use me. In this new model, then, we see the soul having this software transforming itself into fields of energy and information that express themselves as thoughts, feelings, emotions, desires, etc. That then transforming itself into the biochemistry, the neurotransmitters and peptides, and that then transforming itself into biochemical responses, physiological responses, behavioral responses, experience of the world. But we see that there is one continuum, and that the soul, therefore, is a real entity, and it fits in our model of non-local reality. Non-local reality precipitating as space-time events that we call experience. In fact, those people who look at this model, and a number of scientists have explored this model, to mention a few, people like Carl Pribram and also David Bohm, the eminent physicist, have spoken of the holographic model for memory. And I think everyone in this room is probably aware of what a hologram is. A hologram is, to put it simply, a three-dimensional projection of memory. You must have seen holograms in science museums and in Disney World and probably on your MasterCard or Visa. Hologram is a three-dimensional projection of memory. If you wanted to make a hologram of me, for example, what you would do is the following. Let's assume for a moment that this is me, and you want to make a hologram of me. You'd put a laser beam through an instrument which is known as a beam splitter. The beam splitter splits the beam, the laser beam, which is a beam that has one frequency of light, into two beams. One's called an object beam, the other's called a reference beam. The object beam comes at the object, let's say that's me. It scatters into scattered light. The reference beam bounces off a mirror, interferes with the scattered object beam, and creates an interference pattern, which can then be recorded on a photographic plate. Nothing mysterious about this. Looks like a bunch of wiggles and squiggles. But now the magic begins. You take that photographic plate with its interference pattern, and you put a laser beam through it, and you'll get a three-dimensional projection of me similar to me out there as a space-time event. And if the hologram is well made, then you can't tell the difference between me and my hologram. For example, the earlier lecture that you heard was me. This is a hologram, and you don't know the difference. A few months ago, I was meditating, and I had this brilliant insight, even though I'm saying so myself. You know, once in a while, you get these insights, and you know they're true. I had this insight that within 5 years, we'll have the technology to make perfect holograms of ourselves. But not only that, we'll be able to fax them anywhere we want. Then we can simultaneously be in many places, and the crucial question then will be, which one is the real you? In any case, there's something very mysterious about this hologram, because if you took a scissors and you cut up this photographic plate with its interference pattern into 1,000,000 bits, or 1,000,000,000 bits, or 1,000,000,000,000 bits, or 1,000,000,000,000, billion, trillion, trillion bits, and you took the teeniest, weeniest bit of it, put a laser beam through it, you'll get all of me all over again. That's why it's called a hologram. All of it is in every bit of it. All of it is in every bit of it. In fact, every bit of the hologram is the whole thing from a different perspective. And the reason I'm saying this to you, I'm going in such detail, is that scientists are suggesting that holographic memory is what this body is. That you and I have not only personal memories, but impersonal memories. Memories go back to a long time, our childhood, intrauterine life, but because you cannot squeeze the soul into the volume of a body or the span of a lifetime, being non-local, spaceless and timeless, they go back eons of time. And they find that expression through the nervous system into the body, that each cell is a hologram of the entire universe, both personal and impersonal memories. And of course, scientists will tell you that there's a popular phrase in science, in anthropology and developmental sciences, ontogeny replicates phylogeny, which means even as this lifetime's experience, from the fetus to the adult or to the fully developed baby, we replicate the experiences of our species and other species. We have a reptilian brain, we have an amphibian brain, we have the memories of everything that has happened in the entire evolutionary history of not only mankind, but other species as well. And then these memories go back a long time. A few years ago, I was explaining this model to my friend Wayne Dyer, the eminent psychologist. I said, Wayne, do you understand the holographic memory model? He said, of course I do. I went to this, I remember the day of my conception. I said, you do? He said, yes, I went to this picnic with my father and came back with my mother. Now, if you go a little beyond that, you may actually bump into yourself. You may bump into yourself. Because your real self is beyond the memory. It's not the experience, it's the one who's having the experience. And the one who's having the experience, the experiencer, is the timeless factor in every time-bound experience. The experiencer is the timeless factor in every time-bound experience. And that's who you and I really are. This is the basis of healing, too. The word healing, it comes from the word holy, or whole, or wholeness. Healing in this model is nothing other than the return of the memory of wholeness. And when you remember who you really are, then technically speaking, you're healed. Because there's no fear. When you know that there's a part of you that transcends mortality, that transcends time, that in fact, the real you is beyond space and time. The Ayurvedic expression is, as is the atom, so is the universe. As is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. As is the human body, so is the cosmic body. As is the human mind, so is the cosmic mind. And if you don't like the word cosmic mind, then you can call it a non-local field of energy and information with self-referral cybernetic feedback loops. And if you don't like the word soul, you can call it a continuum of probability amplitudes through which this non-local field is manifesting holographically as space-time events. We changed the language, but we're speaking about the same thing. We changed the language, we're speaking about the same thing. William Blake again. What does he say? To see the whole world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. These are holographic descriptions. That you and I are not only made up of the same stuff, the same recycled elements on the periodic table, but the same being in different disguises. And when we know that experientially, then we feel holy, we feel healed, because it's a sacred event to have that transformation of our internal reference point is no longer our self-image, but the self. A Vedic expression says, in Indra's heaven, there's a set of pearls so contained. Pick up one of them and you'll see all of them. That's a holographic description of the universe as well. So I think we have to redefine what it means to be healed. Healing is the loss of fear that comes about when we lose our fear of change because we've discovered a part of ourselves that is beyond change. Now that we have seen the environment, the body, the mind, the soul, and soon we'll see the spirit as part of one continuum, let us, in fact, try and look at this model a little more carefully. And to explain this in detail, I have chosen a model that comes from the ancient tradition of healing from India, a science known as Ayurveda. The word Ayus means science, Veda means knowledge. So the word Ayurveda simply means knowledge of life. The word Ayus means life, Veda means knowledge. So the word means knowledge of life. And this model is credited to a great seer, lived in India in ancient times, Adi Shankara. And I'd like to explain this model to you and see if it has any relevance to us today in the world of science and technology. Can we understand the same model in terms of our current understanding of reality from a scientific perspective? And Adi Shankara says that we have a physical body, a subtle body, and a causal body. The physical body is, of course, in space and time. It's three-dimensional. It exists in space, or at least occupies locations in space, and has moments in time. And it's made up of matter and of energy. And the word energy in Sanskrit is referred to as prana. The Chinese call it chi. The Japanese call it ki. In the Judaic tradition, it's frequently referred to as ruah. Islamic tradition, ruh. Similar ideas exist everywhere. The physical body is made up of body and of matter and energy, and we know both from common sense and from physics that energy can be transformed into matter, and matter can be experienced as energy. And the energy of the universe consists of things like electromagnetism, which gives rise to heat, light, electricity, gravity, which holds us to the ground and makes the earth go around and holds the planets together. And then there are strong and weak forces, which are subatomic forces that we don't have to get into. The point is that this whole universe is energy, and all these energies are one cosmic energy being experienced as different energies. And energy and matter are inseparably one. That's the physical body, which has a pretty short shelf life, usually, about 80 years or so, getting better all the time. Then beyond the facade of molecules is a whole different world, where we experience the mind, the intellect, and the ego, which you can't localize, at least in space, even though it has existence in time. A thought has no locality in space. A thought is unpredictable, like a quantum event. It's fleeting, it's invisible. And therefore, it has no localization in space. But it does have localization in time, because it has a beginning, it has a middle, and an ending. A thought, a feeling, an emotion, they begin, they have a middle, they have an ending. So these realms of abstract existence are termed the subtle body, because you can't experience it through your senses, hence subtle. In the mind, we experience emotions, feelings, desires. In the intellect, we experience ideas, concepts, notions, and beliefs. Beliefs are ideas that we hold to be true. Are they true? They're true if you hold them to be true. Are they universally true? Obviously not. Otherwise, people wouldn't be killing each other for their beliefs. The old expression is, the ancient expression is, beliefs die hard, they outlive the believer. Beyond the intellect is the ego. The ego is our state of object referral. I'd like to define that term. Object referral means that you refer to an object in order to identify yourself. And that's what the ego is. It's object referral. You're referring to something in order to identify yourself. So if I meet you on the street and I ask you, who are you? I don't think you usually respond by saying I'm a holographic expression of the entire universe that is manifesting as a continuum of probability amplitudes for space-time events, which is technically a fairly accurate definition of who you really are. But if I ask you, who are you, you usually respond by naming objects, a name, a passport, a social security number, a job description, a relationship, a bank account, an automobile, a house. You relinquish yourself for your self-image. The ego is the self-image that happens as a result of sacrificing the spirit for the image, as a result of identification with objects. And in this is the birth of time. Time is nothing other than the continuity of memory, which uses the internal reference point as the ego. The internal reference point is the self-image. And the continuity of memory using that as the internal reference point is time. You break the barrier of the ego, you enter a timeless domain, that of the spirit, which cannot, as we saw earlier, which cannot be squeezed into the volume of a body or the span of a lifetime, because the spirit is timeless and spaceless and dimensionless and non-local. As you break the barrier of your ego, which makes it necessary for you to feel offended most of the time, as you break that barrier, you discover this other realm, which is frequently known as the causal body, because it gives rise to the subtle body. The causal body similarly has two components. It has a soul and a spirit. The soul is the continuum of probability amplitudes with those three things: action, memory, and desire, the software. And then beyond that, the field of pure potentiality, which has been frequently referred to in spiritual traditions as the ultimate ground of creation, the spirit, the universal spirit. So if you like spiritual terminology, then it's easy. You have a body, you have energy, you have a mind, you have an intellect, you have an ego, you have a soul, and you have a spirit. That's the spiritual terminology that every spiritual tradition, everywhere in the world, has used. But you could just as easily say that you are made up of matter fields and energy fields and transformation fields and information fields and unified field. Information field, it's a nice word actually. Information means to give rise to form. Information. And these are the transformation fields. And as we go from the most superficial layer of existence to the deeper layers of existence, we find that there is relative non-change. The body has a short shelf life, but the mind, the intellect, and the ego have a longer life than the molecules on which they ride. My physical body is not the same as my last year's model. This is a 1995 model, I believe. The 1994 model is dead. It's gone. It came from the dust, swirled around for a bit, is back in the dust. So that's dead. I haven't died. My feelings, my emotions, my memories are the same. So maybe you see this is already scientific proof for the existence of life after death. It's happening all the time. The emotions have a longer shelf life than the molecules through which they express themselves. And the information field that gives rise to the emotions even longer, till ultimately you end up with the ultimate ground of creation, what David Bohm calls the implicate order, from where everything emerges, the ultimate ground of creation. We could also say that, describe the same model by saying that this is the field of pure potentiality, where the observer, the process of observation, and that which is observed are all there, but they're unmanifest. The seer, the scenery, the process of seeing, they're all there. They're hiding, so to speak. At this level, the information field, the observer or the seer dominates the experience. At this level, the mind, intellect, and ego, the process of seeing, the process of observation dominates. Because how do we observe? Through the filter of the mind, the intellect, and the ego. And at this level, the physical body and the world out there, the object of experience dominates. But if we understand this model, then we see that the observer, the process of observation, and that which is being observed are all essentially different manifestations of the same thing. That the observer and the observed are one, that the seer and the scenery are one, that the knower and the object of knowledge are one, that the lover and the beloved are one. And that is the ultimate goal of all spiritual traditions, to have the experience of unity consciousness, not intellectually, but experientially, and then to be transformed as a result of that experience. That is why the ancient seers, when they defined this model, they said, I'm not in the world is in me. I'm not in the body is in me. I'm not in the mind is in me. The body, the mind, and the world, they happen to me because I curve back within myself and create again and again and again. This then is the ultimate goal of all spiritual traditions and is ultimately the meaning of the word wholeness as well. Now, having said that, I would like to take you through a short experience because I want to show to you that a little process of silence in the mind can bring us into this space between thoughts. Franz Kafka, the great German writer, once said, he said, you need not do anything, remain sitting at your table and listen. Then he said, you don't even have to listen, just wait. Then he said, you don't even have to wait, just learn to become quiet and still and solitary. And the world will freely offer itself to you to be unmasked. It has no choice. It will roll in ecstasy at your feet. Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, said, all of humanity's misery comes from its inability to sit quietly, close the eyes, and do nothing. We are human beings. We are human beings, not human thinkings, not human doings, but human beings. And if you want to know who you are, you have to spend a little time with yourself. The ability to think is an extraordinary human ability. But even more extraordinary and human is the ability to not think. Because when you do that, you get in touch with your own immortal soul, the spirit. A biblical expression says, be still and know that I am God. So let's, for a few moments, just close our eyes and experience the stillness. Don't do anything. Just close your eyes and perhaps observe your breath. And as you become aware of thoughts and sensations and the environment, just simply come back to the breath. And now keep your eyes closed and just have awareness in your whole body. Awareness in your whole body at the level of being. It means awareness in every cell of your body. Consciousness in every cell of your body. The whole body is a lively, self-interacting, intelligent field of consciousness. Of bliss. And you don't have to think these thoughts. All you have to do is have awareness in the body, just that idea, and then the self, being, is in every cell of the body. Perfect balance, perfect integration, perfect order, perfect harmony, pure consciousness, bliss, everywhere in the body. Keep your attention in the body, and you'll see it bubbles with energy. It bubbles with bliss. Okay, you may open your eyes. We did this quite fast, even though time is an illusion. But how many people, first of all, as they just watch their breath, how many people felt that even in a few minutes, as they did that, they became so relaxed that maybe they were even drifting off to sleep? How many people had that experience? Please raise your hands. Well, what does that mean? If in 2 minutes you start watching your breath and you get so relaxed, you start to drift off to sleep, what does that mean? It means you need a lot of sleep. Nothing more than that. Your body is telling you, listen, give me 2 minutes, I want to sleep. You know, in this culture, a very scientific explanation of meditation is that it's the relaxation response. It's to relax. The fact is that the yogis, ancient seers, the word yogi comes from the same root as the Latin word yoke, which means to unify the experience of body, mind, and spirit. And the yogis, who were the original authors of meditation, these guys were in Himalayas, in the caves, they were pretty relaxed to begin with. They weren't trying to relax. They were trying to be more alert. They were trying to eavesdrop on this cosmic mind, on this non-local field of energy and information. And of course, relaxation can be a prelude to that. But please don't think relaxation is the ultimate experience. It's the ultimate experience if we live in a hysterical and melodramatic society. But it's only the prelude to awareness. And awareness is the source of biological information and energy in everything that's alive. The same awareness that filters through this body and creates my world filters through your body and creates another world for you. Same awareness. And in order to get to that awareness, we have to learn to slip in the spaces between thoughts. And when we do that, then we eavesdrop on the software that not only runs the machinery of our own body, but the software that runs the machinery of the universe. And then from that level, if we put our attention on something, then we can activate energy and information. How many people, when they put their attention in the body, felt a little rush of energy, or some tingling, or some warmth? If you did, please raise your hands. So even in 2 minutes, imagine if you were in a cave in the Himalayas for 13 years doing this. You can use your attention and intention to bring about transformations in the body. It gives you infinite flexibility once you begin to experience your body as a bundle of energy and information, and you as the source in the spaces between thoughts as the source of energy and information. Attention is energy, intention is transformation or information. Attention and intention, these are the two components of awareness, which is biological information. And the source of this is in the gap between your thoughts. And all the technologies that are used in the healing traditions of all ancient cultures have to do with the ability to influence energy and informational states as different expressions of consciousness itself. And when you reach a point in your life, when you recognize that, then you begin to have what is called active mastery over life. Active mastery, the closest description to that is in Abraham Maslow's descriptions of the self-actualized person. In Ayurvedic tradition, we say this is the self-referral person. The self-referral person who's not bound or imprisoned by the hypnosis of social conditioning, which is, for the most part, the everyday experience of people. What we call normal in our society is actually the psychopathology of the average. A self-realized person, self-actualized person, according to ancient Vedic tradition, shows at least 10 key characteristics. Number one, their internal reference point has become the spirit, not the ego. They know from their own experience that the spirit is a real force. It may be mysterious, it may be abstract, it may be incomprehensible to most people, but because they have had a direct experience of it, it's their internal reference point. It's more real than gravity, it's more real than time. The second characteristic of this self-realized soul is that they know how to deal with the toxins in their life. The toxins that create havoc in this quantum mechanical body. This refers, of course, to toxic food and toxic drink, but also refers to toxic relationships and toxic emotions. The third characteristic of the self-realized soul is that they have shed their need for approval. It is the ego that needs approval, the ego that seeks external power, the ego that needs to control. The need to control, the need for approval, the need for external power are fear-based needs. They are compulsions that are rooted in fear and threat. The fourth characteristic of the self-realized soul is that they can use the mirror of relationship for their own evolution, knowing that those that we love and those that we hate are both mirrors of the self. We're attracted to those people in whom we see things that we want for ourselves, and we dislike those people in whom we discover traits that we're denying in ourselves. Relationship is a tool for the evolution of our consciousness. The next characteristic of the self-realized soul is that they are aware of their body as the experience of the spirit, that this body with all its sensuality and its sensuousness is part of a sensuous universe, which is full of joy, where birds sing and children play and stars glitter and flowers bloom. This is a universe that is alive with consciousness. That to be centered to the experience of the body is to find the presence of God. That if you cannot find God in a flower, if you cannot find God in a rainbow, if you cannot find God in the eyes of a human being or anything else there, in a blade of grass, you will not find God in any book of religion. And the other characteristics of the self-realized soul are life-centered, present moment awareness. The past is gone, the future is not here, this moment you're free of both. And then, of course, there is the need to shed the burden of judgment. If you understand this model, then the divine, the diabolical, the sinner, the saint, the victor, the vanquished, they're all different disguises. And you need to embrace and know your dark side and become intimate with it if you want to ultimately release it. That you have to replace fear-based behavior with love-based behavior and ultimately begin to see the whole universe as an expression of the self. Because that's all there is, the self. Curving back within myself, I create again and again. I experience this world as an expression of myself. I'm not in the world is in me. I'm not in the body is in me. I'm not in the mind is in me. They happen to me, all these things, as I curve back within myself and create again and again. I'm the immeasurable potential of all that was, is, and will be. And my desires are like seeds left in the ground. They wait for the appropriate season, and they blossom into manifestation. And if you ask the seer, why do you do it? What's the purpose? The answer is, it's so interesting. Why not?